Hi everybody, my name is Alexander Osterwalder. I wrote a book called Business Model Generation together with Yves Pigneur, and the book is used around the world to figure out what are business models and how do we design business models. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to design, test, and build business models, and we're going to dive deeply into the topic with a Swiss invention, and we're going to go into the time machine, which was invented in Switzerland. I'm going to take you back to 1958. Why 1958? Because I would like to introduce you to a person called Chester Carlson. So I learned about Chester Carlson from Henry Chesbrough, and he told me the story about Chester Carlson. So Chester Carlson was at the head of a research team at a company called Haloid, and he invented the first modern-day photocopying machine. This was an amazing machine. It could make 2,000 copies a day at a time where you could maybe make 15 to 30 with a very smelly and dirty process. Okay, so that was a big technological jump. Problem was that this technology was very expensive. It was about 7 to 8 times more expensive than anything known at the time. So what do you do if you have this wonderful technology? You're not quite sure how you can bring it to the market. So Haloid went to the consultants, a company called Arthur D. Little, and they asked them, what should we do? Arthur D. Little did their market research, came back. What do you think they told Haloid? Well, they said, there's no market. They went out, they searched. Of course, you couldn't sell a technology that was so expensive. So Haloid didn't listen. They went back to the drawing board, and they came up with a new business model. It's actually the business model that defined the photocopying industry until today. So they thought, well, what if we allowed companies to lease the technology for $95 a month, and they would get 2,000 photocopies for free, but every time they would make an additional copy in that month, they would have to pay a couple of cents per copy. So what happened was that companies jumped on this offer. They loved the leasing of this great technology, and they started photocopying not 2,000 times a month, but 2,000 times a day, which means that from day 2 onwards, Haloid, which became Xerox, had amazing growth rates. They started to earn substantial amounts of money on millions, billions of photocopies that were made. Pretty interesting story. Now let's get back into the time machine and let's move to 1997. And I want to introduce you to two people who probably don't need any introduction. Larry Page and Sergey Brin. Probably you know them very well. Now they came up with another invention, or we could say they popularized the first modern-day search engine. They had a different problem. Their product, their service, was not too expensive. It was free. Now how do you make money from free? I think they have proven how you can do that. They figured out how to make money from contextualized advertising by selling search terms. And not just by selling them, by auctioning them off. So the pricing mechanism made the big difference. Now if you look at those two examples, what do they have in common? What's similar between those two examples? What do you think? I'll give you 3 points. The first point, it's a very important one, is that in both cases, the product innovation, the technology innovation alone was not sufficient. It was important. It was even a core part of the success, but alone it was not sufficient. It was the combination between technology and product innovation and the business model. So you really want to figure out how business models, products, technology, how they fit together and how they can lead to success and give you a competitive advantage. The second point was that they didn't copy from competitors. Nobody did anything like that, so they had to invent new business models. Now what's the first thing we do today? We look around us and we try to figure out what do others do. And we might want to be a little bit better, a little bit faster, maybe a little bit cheaper. But sometimes it can be very powerful to move ahead and try out something new, a new business model, because that's what can give you a real competitive edge. And now let's look at the third point. What do you think? Could they prove up front that these business models would work? Very tough, right? They didn't know that these business models would work. So they had to experiment. They had to experiment to figure out if this would work. And that obviously requires some risk taking. And what I'll talk about a little bit at the end of the presentation is, could we test business models? Let's see. So there are three things that we don't do well when it comes to business models. And those three things were addressed in the points that we've seen before. And that's what I'm going to talk about the next couple of minutes. First, how do we discuss business models? When I say how do we discuss business models, I mean how do we go beyond products and services to think about all the pieces that make a business successful. And the second point is, well, how do we come up with innovative business models? If we can't copy from around us, well, we might need some techniques and tools to come up with great business models. And the third point is, how do we test business models before we build them? Three interesting points. So let's dive deep into the first one. So I want to look at how we discuss business models. And we'll start with a little mini case here. And I want to get you to work, even though it's a webinar, right? But we're going to look at coffee. Coffee is an interesting industry. It's a commodities business, right? More coffee growers than ever before. Vietnam hasn't existed as a coffee grower a couple of decades ago, and now they're one of the biggest. So let me ask you a question related to my home country, because I have the data there, to Switzerland, but it's a similar phenomena happening around the world. How much do you think do we pay less or more for coffee consumed at home, in our homes? What would your guess be? Is it 20% less? Is it 20% more? What do you think? Turns out, Swiss are paying 600 to 800% more for coffee consumed at home. And it's not George Clooney, it's actually the brand for which George Clooney stands in most parts of the world. It's Nespresso. Nespresso has changed the business model of espresso, the selling of coffee to households. And at the heart of their business model, there's a machine, well designed, with aluminium pods, coffee inside. You take the aluminium pods, you put them into the machine, you press a button, and out comes a very good espresso. So good that even Italians will like it. Okay? That's the technology, that's the product. The results are really amazing. It's still, after 2 decades, one of the fastest growing businesses within Nestlé, the food empire, actually the biggest food company in the world. Pretty impressive. And that means growth rates of 30% per annum for the last decade. That's pretty impressive. Okay, if you're Google, if you're Facebook, maybe not. But for most of us, 10 years of growth rates like that is great. Now that represents a business of over $3 billion with one product line mainly, coffee, machines and pods. Okay? Interesting. Now let me get you to do a little exercise. Question to you is, what made Nespresso's business model so successful? Take a couple of minutes, describe their business model, and try to point out what made them so successful. Click on the pause button, take some time, and figure out what makes them so successful. So back to the question, what did you come up with? Let's see. I'm actually not just interested in what you wrote down, but how you did it. Did you just think about it, not write anything down? Did you write down a couple of bullet points? Or did you even draw a diagram? Now, if you drew a diagram, you're already pretty advanced in your thinking. I think we need to apply more visual thinking. We need to understand how the pieces of a business model fit together. But now, before digging down deep into what made Nespresso's business model so successful, I want us to do another little exercise, and it will be related to the first, okay? Second exercise, take 1 or 2 minutes to define what a business model is. Since you've described the business model of Nespresso, you should know what a business model is. So take 2 minutes to ask yourself, what's a business model? What does that mean to you? And write down your definition. Click on the pause button and do this. What's a business model? Write down your definition. So I asked this question all around the world. You know what's really funny? This is how the answer looks. Have you ever heard of this story of the Tower of Babel, where people tried to build a tower that would reach all the way to heaven, and God came down on earth and he created languages so they couldn't finish the tower? That's how it looks like when we discuss business models. I think it's a word we use all the time, but we're not speaking the same language. We don't really understand each other when we're talking about business models. That's very often the case. So let's look at how a meeting looks like, where people discuss either their existing business model or they try to figure out a business model for their new product or technology. Starts like this. Blah, blah, blah. Huh? Blah, blah, blah. Huh? Blah, blah, blah. So this is not because we don't have a couple of smart people around the table. It's because we're not speaking the same language. And this phenomena is called blah, blah, blah. So Dan Rome, friend of mine, he came out with a book called Blah, Blah, Blah. What to do when words don't work. And I think when it comes to business models, we need to use words and pictures, diagrams, to really understand what we're talking about and how the pieces of a business model fit together. So that's why we came up, and when I say we, it's Yves Pigneur and myself who wrote the book Business Model Generation, why we came up with a language to have a better discussion about our business models, to discuss our existing business models, but more importantly, to discuss new business models. So we invented something called the Business Model Canvas. And the Business Model Canvas is like a canvas to paint on. You can describe existing business models, you can describe new business models, you can challenge business models, and ultimately you can use it to invent new business models with the same language. Why the word canvas? Because you can paint out an existing business model or a new business model and make it tangible. So let's look into this. It's about 9 building blocks. The first building block is customer segments. You need to ask yourself, which customers are you serving in your business? Let's look at a newspaper. What are the customer segments of a newspaper? Well, in fact, there are mainly 2. The readers, who want to be informed and entertained, and the advertisers, who want to reach an audience and sell something. So 2 different customer segments with 2 different jobs to be done. And for both segments and both jobs, you will have a different value proposition, a set of products and services that will help the customer get the job done. So once you know who you're targeting and what you're offering, you need to ask yourself, how do these customers want to be reached? Through which channels? Through which channels do they want to communicate with me as a company, as an organization? Through which channels do they want to receive the goods? Is it a physical channel? Is it a digital channel? Are we talking about stores? Are we talking about direct channels? Are we talking about indirect channels? So ask yourself, how does each customer segment want to be reached? The next block is about the customer relationships you establish. So if you're a Swiss private bank, you will have a very personal relationship. A banker will try to build up a very personal relationship with a wealthy family, maybe even over generations. That will have implications on the rest of the business model because it will be people-based, very personal, but not very scalable. If you're Amazon, what do you think? Does Amazon have a personal relationship with us? Well, not personal in the sense of a private bank, but personalized, because they understand our buying behavior and they recommend books to us. So Amazon will have a very automated relationship, but personalized. based on systems, based on computers, based on servers. So very different and much more scalable. Now you could also look at it in a different way. So Steve Blank uses the customer relationships to describe how you get, keep, and grow customers, which is a very important point because customers, you need to acquire them first. And once you have them, you better figure out how you're going to keep them. And if you don't have enough customers, it's not going to work out, so you want to grow. The next question is, what are people or companies that you're serving really willing to pay for? And how? Do they want to pay for something that they buy? Do they want to pay a subscription? Are they going to pay a licensing fee? And through which pricing mechanisms? Remember we mentioned Google? Google is auctioning off their search terms for advertising. They're not just selling them. That makes them much richer than if they would just sell them. So that's the right-hand part of the business model canvas. The part that shows which value you're creating, for whom, and how you're delivering that, and how you're capturing value for yourself as an organization. Now we want to look at the left-hand side of the canvas, where we ask ourselves, how are we going to do it? What do we need to create value? The first question is, which resources do I really need to create value? Do I need factories? Do I need a brand? Do I need intellectual property? Do I need servers? What are the key things that you need to have to create that value that you're promising on the right-hand side? And then the next question is, well, we know what we need to have, but what is it that we really need to do, that we really need to be good at in our business model? Which activities do we need to excel at? Is it marketing and sales? Is it research and development? Is it managing servers? What are those activities that are crucial in our business model? And since we're in the 21st century, we're not going to do everything ourselves. We're going to work with partners. So you want to ask yourself, in addition to suppliers, who are the key partners that can leverage your business model, that can turn your business model into something more powerful? So an interesting example here is the social gaming company Zynga, which built their entire business model, or a big chunk of it, on the back of Facebook, which became a partnership. And probably Zynga couldn't have scaled so quickly without using Facebook as a partner. Now, if you know all those three elements on the left-hand side of your canvas, very quickly you can sketch out what your core costs are. And then you have a big picture understanding of the logic of your business. All the pieces that you need to create, deliver, and capture value. All those elements that are important to succeed in business. Now, that's just a concept. Let's turn it into a real tool that we can use in our everyday work, where it really becomes a canvas on which we can paint out our business model. And I use sticky notes, or a new tool called Staties, to map out business models. That's very powerful because you will make it tangible. Ask yourself, what are or who are the customers? Sticky note. Well, if those are the customers, what value am I offering them? Sticky note. How am I reaching my customers? Sticky note. Oh, if that's the value I'm creating, that's the way I'm delivering it, well, what resources do I need? Sticky note. What activities do I need? Sticky note. So you can map out your entire business model, the business model you want to create or the business model that you already have. It will give you a clear picture and a better understanding of all the pieces of your business model. Now let's get back to our mini case. So we discussed Nespresso. And at the heart of the Nespresso business model is a machine with the pods, right? But let's look at what was particular in their business model that made them so successful. So they had a very deliberate strategy. Their strategy was to sell the Nespresso machines through retail channels, all the retail channels possible, to households, mainly, big part of their business. They would earn money from a one-time transactional sales, but most of that money would go to their partners, the machine manufacturers. Now, why do they sell through retail? What do you think? Because they want to reach as many people as possible. Now, here's where it gets interesting. For the Nespresso pods with the coffee inside that you put in the machine, they didn't use retail. They only sell through their own channels. First, mail order, call center, then obviously Nespresso.com, and then afterwards they built Nespresso stores. Which means they had to build as a key resource all their own channels. This is curious. Why did they make a difference between the machines and the pods? Well, because they understood the dynamics of the strategy there. That if they would get the machine in the households, basically you don't have a choice anymore. You're locked in. Once you have the machine, you can only use Nespresso pods. So you would automatically go to their channels to get the pods. So the pods, they sell them only through direct channels. What's the consequence? Well, you're going to buy those pods in a repetitive way again and again and again, recurring revenues. But most interestingly, well, if there's no more middleman, all the revenues go right into the pockets of Nespresso. So they earn more money by selling directly. So let's look at the left-hand side of the canvas. What do they really need to make this happen? Let's look at the key resources. What do you think are the key resources that Nespresso needs to make their business model reality? Couple of things. One of the most important parts are the patents. They have to protect their system, so nobody else could make pods that would fit in that machine. And they defended that for a very long time. Turns out, one company found a way around that with biodegradable pods. Turns out that some of their patents are expiring in 2012. So it will be very challenging for Nespresso to rejuvenate their business model. What else do they need? Well, coffee, that's a no-brainer. But you know what? Coffee is really important because they try to get the best coffee. And then the brand. If you're in consumer goods like this, you better have a good brand to really make it possible. And then they built some really, really high-end production facilities to create the best pods with the best quality coffee inside in the world. Now let's look at the activities. I put 3 things there. First one, business to consumer distribution. It was the first time for Nestlé in their company Nespresso to send small boxes to individuals. Before, they used to send big pallets to retailers with their Nescafé brand, where they were shipping coffee around the world. So they switched from business to business distribution in the Nespresso model to business to consumer logistics and distribution. That's a pretty important shift. And then they want to excel obviously at marketing because they're in consumer goods. And the third part is production. They focus on really producing the best quality coffee. And when you have the left-hand side mapped out, very quickly you can figure out the costs. Production, business to consumer distribution, and marketing. And boom, you have the entire business model on one poster. Isn't that interesting? Now there's another reason why I use the Nespresso case. When they started out, Nespresso almost failed. They almost went bankrupt with exactly the same product and technology. Isn't that curious? Well, turns out that they tried in a joint venture with machine manufacturers to sell the Nespresso system through the sales force of the machine manufacturer to office buildings. And you know what? The offices weren't interested, and the sales force of the machine manufacturers weren't interested either. So this business model didn't work, fell apart with exactly the same technology. So here, the difference between success and failure was not the product and technology alone. It was all the pieces of the business model in combination with a great product and technology. Now, Nestle didn't stop there. They went on to create another system, Dolce Gusto, which focuses on cappuccino. And you might know that the cappuccino market and the Nespresso market, the espresso market, are not the same thing, two different market segments. So we might say, well, this is just a different machine. They probably use the same business model. They didn't. They figured out that it would make more sense to use a different business model for this machine. And they didn't stop there. They started innovating in other fields, and they came up with a new brand and technology called Babiness, where you would have baby formula in a pod. You could take the pod, put it in the machine, press a button, and in 30 seconds you would get the bottle ready for your baby. They used a different business model for this one. And they didn't stop there. They went on with something that they're testing now in 2012, which is special tea, with a different business model, obviously. So what does this mean? That Nestle, in their business, they're going beyond a product portfolio towards a business model portfolio. That's pretty interesting. What was my biggest learning in the last couple of years using the business model canvas? It was actually going beyond the blah, blah, blah. I've seen many groups, entrepreneurs, executives, discussing business models, thinking about business models. By using the canvas, they started really thinking deeply about each building block that they would put onto the canvas. They negotiate. They get to a consensus. And every block that's up there makes sense. So you start having a good understanding as an individual and as a team of what the business model is. And you will have much, much better conversations. Now let's look at the design of business models. How do we come up with interesting business models? And when I use the word design, I don't mean form. I mean the techniques and tools that designers use in their business. What do designers do every day? They create stuff. They're trained to create stuff. What do we do in entrepreneurship? We create companies. So what if we could use the tools from design in business? Let's look at one design profession. Let's look at architecture. And let's study Frank Gehry a little bit. Very interesting architect. And let's look at one of his iconic buildings, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao. So Frank Gehry and his team were brought in by the mayor of Bilbao. Mayor of Bilbao told them, you know what? We have one of the ugliest cities in Spain, or in the Basque Country to be concrete. We would like you to transform our city with a building. Now, is it heavenly intuition and creative genius that rains down on Frank Gehry and his team to come up with a building like that? Maybe a little bit of it. But more importantly, they have tools and techniques to figure out what they want to do. And they do a lot of study models, different types of models, sketches. They go in very different directions, different materials, different shapes. They work with city scale, landscape scale, building scale, to figure out which alternatives could really work. And only then, when they feel that the design has matured, do they choose a direction. So it's not prototyping to refine, it's prototyping to explore alternatives. And only when they feel that the design has matured do they select one direction. Now, what does that have to do with you and me and organizations? Well, it's the same thing. Rather than falling in love with your first idea, with your first business model, you should be exploring multiple different alternatives, possibilities of what you could do. Think them through. What if I gave away my product for free? How would I make money? What if I created a business model with zero fixed costs, only variable costs? How would that look? What if I did a business model with my biggest competitor? How would the business model look? You can explore different alternatives. And here is the important part, not by spending a day or a week on each individual alternative, but by sketching out rough models. Take 15 minutes to think of one. Take another 15 minutes to think through another possibility. By doing those rough sketches quickly with the business model canvas, you will get to better ideas. You will have better business models. You will come up with more powerful alternatives. You can use the business model canvas, which you can download on the web and get it for free. It's even under a Creative Commons license, so it's all for you. The important thing here is that you don't fall in love with your first idea, because as we will see afterwards, the second, third, 10th idea that might really work has nothing to do with the first one. So you better think through and test multiple possibilities. And this is what designers call prototyping. And I like the way Tom Wojcik put it. He says, prototyping is the conversation you have with your ideas. Wonderful quote. Let's look at it very briefly at a mini case study. And I want us to follow the story of Jigar Shah, who's an amazing entrepreneur. Jigar aspired to change the solar energy industry. He wanted large companies to be powered by solar energy. But he had to go through a whole learning process to come up with the right model. So Jigar was working in the solar energy industry. And this is how it more or less looked, the traditional business model. Solar panel manufacturers would sell panels and installations to mid to large size organizations, and they would be paid for those installations. There's a problem with that. Large companies were not interested in adopting this. Why is that? Because the upfront investment was too high. So that was a big pain point. Large or mid-sized organizations would not be willing to bring up the upfront investment to invest in green energy. So that business model doesn't work. And Jigar Shah experienced that firsthand because he was in the sales force of a solar panel manufacturer. So Jigar came up with a different idea. What if he gave away the panels for free? Well, that would definitely eliminate the pain point. But how do you do that profitably? Let's do another little exercise. You are now Jigar Shah. Your task is to figure out how could you get these companies to switch to solar energy industry. So brainstorm around different possibilities, alternatives of how to give away solar panels for free, but still building a profitable company. Easy to give away, but how do you give away profitably? Click on pause, take a couple of minutes, and come up with 3, 4, or 5 different alternatives of what you could do. Here's the business model canvas that you can use for that. Now let's look at what Jigar did. He said, these are the companies I want to target. And the way I'm going to do it is that I'm going to sell them something that you can already find in oil and gas. It's called power purchasing agreements. So he would go to a company and say, look, I can offer you green energy at a very competitive price for the next 10 years. Please sign with me for 10 years and you'll get energy at a fixed price, no volatility. Are you interested? Many companies jumped on the offer. They were very interested to get energy at a fixed price for 10 years because that would allow him to plan. So Jigar acquired a lot of these power purchasing agreements, which he sold through his sales force, and he was expecting to be paid for the next 10 years through power purchasing agreements. On the left-hand side of the canvas, he would obviously have to set up the infrastructure to do that. Question is now, well, how can you finance that? So Jigger thought, I have proof that I can earn money for a decade. Well, that should be interesting for investors. Turns out they were not interested. So Jigger had a problem. How would he do it? He figured out a new way to make this business model work. He had to pivot to a new business model. So what he did was, he took those power purchasing agreements and he turned them into smaller investments that could be sold through institutional investors and private banks to private investors and other institutional investors. And you know what? That was very interesting for a lot of investors because now they became technically the owners of green energy, got the payments from the power purchasing agreements, and because they were owners of green energy, they got tax cuts and subsidies from the government. So all of a sudden, this business model took off. Well, for Jigger it meant, and son Edison, that the revenue streams slightly changed. He earned from investment fees, and he earned from the installation and maintenance costs. It also meant that he had to change the backstage of his business model a little bit. But the results of this last pivot were amazing. Jigger's company, son Edison, became the biggest provider of solar energy in the US. And you know what? Jigger sold his company for $200 million after a couple of years. And he's now the CEO of the Carbon War Room, which was co-founded by Richard Branson. What a story. So, if we think of what happened here, we can learn that innovative business models allow us to unlock potential opportunities that weren't readily available with the existing business models before. So Jigger Shaw didn't focus on technology innovation. He figured out a new business model to unlock the potential of this market. Now let's look at the last part, and I will stay brief here. The testing of business models. This was for me something very new that I learned by reading what's going on in this area. The biggest learning was that even with the best thinking, even by prototyping business models, figuring out what could really work, getting the smartest people together to create the smartest business models, well, there's one thing we need to realize. We're still talking about a series of hypotheses here, or if we want to use a simple word, well, a series of guesses. We don't know if a business model is going to work, even if it looks very powerful on paper and it makes all the sense of the world. We don't know if it's going to work. What we really need to figure out if the market is really interested in our business model. Remember Jigger Shaw and his story? So for me, the eye-opener was this book, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany by Steve Blank. I learned from this book that you could test business models before you build them. That was a very powerful learning for me. And the underlying idea here is that you need to get out of the building and test all the hypotheses of your business model with your customers, your channel partners, your manufacturing or service partners to figure out, are your hypotheses realistic? Will it work or not? So let me draw this up conceptually. The first layer we talked about was the business model layer. We talked about that quite a bit now over the last couple of minutes. We will get to our best guess here by figuring out from all the alternatives that we thought through which dynamics could really work. But once we have that, we need to extract the hypothesis underlying this business model. We need to ask ourselves, what really needs to be true for this to work? Which hypothesis do we have to test to make this work? So making these hypotheses explicit is already a pretty good thing. But we should go a step further and design a test for each hypothesis to really figure out, well, will this work? And once we've done this, we'll have a better chance of succeeding. So let me draw this up, how this would look. Basically means that we're looking at business models over a time axis, where we might have our best guess on paper, which will look amazing because we're a smart group of entrepreneurs or corporate executives that are doing corporate innovation. But once we figured out the hypothesis and we started describing how we're going to test that, how we're going to go out of the building, we're going to learn that, you know what? This hypothesis doesn't work. This hypothesis doesn't work. So we're going to come up with a new business model in the next iteration or the next pivot, where we're going to change and adapt the business model canvas in a way that fits from what we've learned when we got out of the building. And we'll do that until we feel confident here over time that we have a business model that works, where all the hypotheses are proven true. So the business model will breathe over time. It will live over time. And without the testing, we're taking a pretty big risk that our business model is not going to work. So I hope you learned something. Thank you very much for your attention, and good luck with all your new ideas, your prototypes, and the testing of your business models. Hope to see you soon.